What if one general's refusal to answer a simple question almost triggered a Third World War? In the autumn of 1950, the United States stood at the edge of a catastrophe so enormous, so quietly engineered by miscalculation and arrogance, that the men responsible for preventing it barely slept. President Harry S. Truman, a former artillery officer from Missouri who had dropped 2 atomic bombs to end one war, now found himself desperately trying to prevent another. His greatest fear was not the North Korean army, which had already been pushed back across the 38th parallel. His greatest fear had a different name, the Yalu River. That narrow, winding body of water separating North Korea from Manchuria, China, was more than a geographic boundary. It was a tripwire. And the man holding the match dangerously close to it was General Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Commander of United Nations forces, a figure so theatrical, so convinced of his own infallibility, that he treated presidential concern as mere interference from lesser minds. The question Truman needed answered in October 1950 was devastatingly simple: how close are your forces to China's border? The answer he received would change everything. If this kind of buried history moves something in you, please subscribe to this channel right now, like this video, share it with someone who loves real history, and leave a comment below telling us what part of this story surprised you the most. Your support is what makes this kind of storytelling possible. By the summer of 1950, the Korean Peninsula had exploded into one of the most violent and swift military confrontations the post-war world had yet seen. On June 25th of that year, 90,000 North Korean troops crossed the 38th parallel in the early morning hours, equipped with Soviet-made T-34 tanks and supported by a command structure trained directly under Moscow's guidance. The Republic of Korea's forces crumbled within days. Seoul fell on June 28, 3 days after the invasion began. President Truman, without a formal declaration of war, committed American forces under the banner of a United Nations police action, a political framing designed to avoid the word war, while fighting one in every meaningful sense. General Douglas MacArthur, already the most celebrated American military commander alive, was appointed to lead the coalition forces. He was 70 years old, had served in 3 major conflicts, wore his officer's cap crushed at a deliberately rakish angle, and smoked a corncob pipe as though the gesture itself was a statement of dominance. He had not set foot on American soil in over a decade. He lived and commanded from Tokyo, surrounded by staff officers who rarely contradicted him and almost never delivered unwelcome news. This distance from Washington, both physical and psychological, would prove to be one of the most dangerous elements of the entire conflict. MacArthur's military genius was not a myth. On September 15, 1950, he launched one of the most audacious amphibious landings in military history at Incheon, a port city on the western coast of Korea considered nearly impossible to assault due to its extreme tidal variations and narrow approach channels. Military planners in Washington and Tokyo had opposed the plan almost unanimously. The Joint Chiefs of Staff presented MacArthur with a list of objections so lengthy it filled multiple pages. MacArthur dismissed every single one. He stood before the assembled commanders and delivered a speech so theatrical, so compelling, so rich with historical reference and personal conviction, that several officers reportedly left the room believing the operation would succeed simply because MacArthur willed it. And it did. The Incheon landing succeeded brilliantly. Within 2 weeks, United Nations forces had liberated Seoul and effectively shattered the North Korean army's supply lines. By late September, Kim Il-sung's forces were in full retreat, collapsing northward in a disorganized rout. MacArthur's reputation, already the stuff of legend, reached a kind of mythological peak. The general who had orchestrated the island-hopping campaign across the Pacific, the man who accepted Japan's surrender on the deck of the USS Missouri, had done it again. And this triumph, paradoxically, became the seed of the disaster that followed. With North Korea effectively defeated as a coherent military force, the question of what to do next became the most consequential strategic debate of the early Cold War. Truman and the Joint Chiefs authorized MacArthur to pursue operations north of the 38th parallel, but with a critical and explicit caveat: no non-Korean forces were to approach the Manchurian or Soviet borders. The directive issued on September 27, 1950, was as clear as military language could make it. MacArthur acknowledged it and proceeded to interpret it through the lens of his own strategic vision, which involved nothing less than the complete military unification of the Korean Peninsula under a pro-Western government. He drove his forces northward at remarkable speed. The North Korean capital of Pyongyang fell on October 19, 1950. United Nations troops were moving in several columns toward the Yalu River, the Chinese border, with a momentum and confidence that felt, from Tokyo, like inevitable triumph. In Washington, however, an entirely different kind of intelligence was accumulating on desks that MacArthur either ignored or dismissed. Chinese communist forces had been massing in Manchuria for weeks. Premier Zhou Enlai had delivered explicit warnings through diplomatic backchannels, through the Indian ambassador K.M. Panikkar in Beijing, that China would not tolerate the approach of hostile forces toward its border. MacArthur called these warnings a diplomatic bluff of the first order. What made the situation genuinely terrifying for Truman was not just the military stakes. It was the profound uncertainty about what MacArthur actually knew, believed, and intended. The general had developed a habit, almost an art form, of presenting his superiors with facts arranged to support conclusions he had already reached. Intelligence assessments from his command in Tokyo were repeatedly optimistic in ways that defied the evidence being gathered elsewhere. The CIA, the State Department, and even some of MacArthur's own field commanders were receiving fragmentary but deeply alarming reports of Chinese military movements south of the Yalu. On October 1, 1950, South Korean forces advancing in the east crossed the 38th parallel. On October 8, Mao Zedong issued the formal order for Chinese People's Volunteer Forces to enter Korea. On October 14, the first Chinese units crossed the Yalu River at night, in secret, without air cover, moving in disciplined silence through mountain terrain that MacArthur's air reconnaissance had failed to adequately monitor. By late October, American and South Korean patrols were making contact with Chinese soldiers, capturing prisoners who identified their units as regular Chinese military formations. These contacts were reported. And then, inexplicably, the Chinese forces vanished back into the mountains, having delivered their warning in blood and then withdrawn, waiting to see if the message was understood. It was not. It was against this backdrop of accumulating danger and alarming intelligence gaps that President Truman made a decision that was, for him, deeply uncomfortable. He would meet MacArthur in person. The two men had never met face to face. Truman had offered previous opportunities and MacArthur had declined with elaborately courteous excuses, never once considering that traveling to meet his commander-in-chief was a basic obligation rather than an optional convenience. Truman, who had a temper he kept carefully controlled and a capacity for blunt assessment that he rarely displayed publicly, chose Wake Island as the meeting point, a tiny coral atoll in the Central Pacific that split the geographic difference between Washington and Tokyo. The meeting was scheduled for October 15, 1950. Truman's aircraft, the Independence, landed first. MacArthur's plane arrived 30 minutes late, a detail Truman noted with visible irritation and later recorded in his diary. The general greeted the president at the bottom of the aircraft stairs with a handshake but without the salute that protocol required. The symbolism was not lost on the small assembly of aides and journalists. MacArthur brought no formal notes, no staff intelligence briefings, no maps. He arrived as a man certain of his conclusions, ready to reassure rather than to inform. But the questions Truman needed answered were not the reassuring kind. The Wake Island meeting lasted approximately 90 minutes in its formal session, with additional informal exchanges bringing the total encounter to just over 3 hours. Truman asked MacArthur directly about the probability of Chinese or Soviet intervention. MacArthur's answer, delivered with characteristic certainty, was that the chance of Chinese entry into the war was very little. He estimated that China had perhaps 300,000 troops in Manchuria, that perhaps 100 to 125,000 were distributed along the Yalu, but that Chinese air support was negligible and Chinese logistics incapable of sustaining large-scale offensive operations across the river. He told the president that the war would effectively be over by Thanksgiving. He told him that he hoped to begin withdrawing the 8th Army to Japan by Christmas. He said the boys would be home for the holidays. Truman, who had learned to read men in the brutal political landscapes of Missouri machine politics and 4 years in the White House, listened carefully. He later wrote that he found MacArthur impressive and direct. He also noted, privately, that something about the general's certainty felt performed rather than earned. The intelligence on the ground, which was arriving at the White House through channels separate from MacArthur's command, told a different and far more complicated story. Subscribe to this channel if you haven't already, like this video right now, share it with anyone who cares about the moments when history turned on a single conversation, and drop a comment below telling us what you found most surprising about this story so far. We're at the halfway point of one of history's most consequential miscalculations, and what comes next is even more extraordinary. Less than 2 weeks after Wake Island, reality delivered its verdict on MacArthur's confident assessment with a violence that stunned the entire United Nations command. On the night of November 25th and 26th, 1950, approximately 300,000 Chinese soldiers poured across the Yalu River and struck United Nations forces along a massive front in one of the most devastating surprise offensives in modern military history. The attack came at night, guided by bugles and flares and whistles, weapons not of technology but of coordination and psychological terror. The U.S. 8th Army on the Western Front collapsed under the assault and began a retreat that would become the longest in American military history, covering over 100 miles before the line could be stabilized. In the east, the 1st Marine Division and elements of the Army's 7th Infantry Division were encircled at the chosen reservoir in conditions of brutal cold that dropped to -35 degrees Fahrenheit. 17,000 United Nations troops fought their way out of that encirclement over 2 weeks of combat so savage that survivors rarely spoke of it in detail for decades afterward. Generals who had been planning victory parades were now drafting emergency evacuation contingency plans for the entire peninsula. MacArthur, in Tokyo, was describing the situation as an entirely new war. The political and strategic consequences of the Chinese intervention reverberated across every level of American government and alliance relations. In London, Prime Minister Clement Attlee flew to Washington in early December 1950 after Truman, at a press conference, failed to explicitly rule out the use of nuclear weapons in Korea. The British, whose troops were fighting alongside Americans on the peninsula and whose cities were within range of Soviet bombers, were horrified. Attlee and Truman held 4 days of intense meetings beginning December 4th, during which the British leader pressed for restraint, for negotiated limits on the conflict, and for assurance that atomic decisions would not be made unilaterally by Washington. Truman provided verbal reassurances but resisted any formal commitments. Inside the National Security Council, figures like Secretary of State Dean Acheson and Secretary of Defense George Marshall were engaged in urgent debates about the very definition of American strategic objectives. Had the goal always been simply to restore the 38th parallel, or had MacArthur's northward advance represented a legitimate expansion of the mandate? And if China could not be challenged directly, what did the conflict mean, and what could victory even look like now? These questions had no easy answers, and they were being asked in real time, while men were dying in the Korean winter. MacArthur's response to catastrophe was characteristically grandiose and increasingly dangerous. He began, without authorization, making public statements that contradicted official American policy. He proposed blockading the Chinese coast, bombing Manchurian bases across the Yalu, using nationalist Chinese forces from Taiwan to open a second front against mainland China. Each of these proposals, if implemented, risked direct war with China and potentially the Soviet Union, which had a mutual defense treaty with Beijing signed in February 1950. Truman and the Joint Chiefs sent repeated instructions to MacArthur to clear all public communications through Washington. The general complied selectively and temporarily. In March 1951, MacArthur sent a letter directly to Republican House Minority Leader Joseph Martin, who read it aloud on the floor of the House of Representatives on April 5, 1951. In that letter, MacArthur argued that Asia, not Europe, was the decisive theater of the Cold War, and that restraint in Korea was a policy of appeasement. He used the phrase, "There is no substitute for victory." He had written publicly to a political opposition leader, contradicting his commander-in-chief's stated policy, on an active matter of wartime national security. This was not insubordination. It was something qualitatively worse. Harry Truman had been deliberate, had consulted widely, and had given MacArthur more latitude than most presidents would have tolerated. But the April 5 letter was a constitutional matter as much as a military one. The principle of civilian control over the armed forces was not a preference or a tradition to be observed when convenient. It was the foundational architecture of American democratic governance, tested by this crisis as it had not been tested since the Civil War. On April 9, 1951, Truman consulted with Atchison, Marshall, chairman of the Joint Chiefs Omar Bradley, and Averell Harriman. Bradley would later say that MacArthur's proposed strategy would have involved the United States in the wrong war, at the wrong place, at the wrong time, and with the wrong enemy. On April 10, Truman signed the order relieving Douglas MacArthur of all his commands. MacArthur learned of his dismissal not from a formal military courier as protocol required, but from a news broadcast picked up by a staff aide, because the White House feared the general might preemptively resign to control the public narrative. The firing of the most famous general in America, in the middle of an active war, was a political earthquake of the highest magnitude. MacArthur returned to the United States for the first time in 14 years to a reception of stunning proportions. Millions lined the streets in San Francisco and Washington and New York. He addressed a joint session of Congress on April 19, 1951, delivering a speech that ended with the phrase, "Old soldiers never die, they just fade away," drawing tears from hardened legislators who had disagreed with nearly everything he said. But as the weeks passed and Senate hearings examined the full record, something shifted in public perception. General Omar Bradley testified that MacArthur's strategy would have widened the war to catastrophic proportions. General Matthew Ridgway, who replaced MacArthur and quietly, competently stabilized the Korean front, received almost none of the public attention his achievement deserved. The armistice that finally ended active hostilities came on July 27, 1953, restoring the border almost exactly where it had been before the war began, which was precisely the outcome Truman had been trying to achieve all along, and which MacArthur had dismissed as insufficient. The question Truman had asked at Wake Island, and the answer MacArthur had provided with such thundering certainty, had cost more than 36,000 American lives and millions of Korean and Chinese casualties. History does not always punish the wrong answer immediately. Sometimes it waits, and then it answers in full. The story of Truman and MacArthur is not simply a story about two men or even about one war. It is a story about the permanent and irreducible danger of certainty in the face of complexity, of institutional arrogance meeting political reality, of a question asked too late and answered with too much confidence. The Yalu River still runs today, still marks that border between North Korea and China, still carries within its geography the memory of the moment when the world came extraordinarily close to a conflict that could have redefined civilization. Truman, who left office in January 1953 with some of the lowest approval ratings of any modern president, is now consistently ranked by historians among the great American presidents, precisely because of decisions like this one, decisions that were politically costly, publicly misunderstood, and historically correct. MacArthur faded as he predicted old soldiers would. The boys did not come home by Christmas 1950. Many of them did not come home at all. If this story moved you, made you think, or revealed something about history you had never been told, please subscribe to this channel right now, hit the like button, share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and leave a comment below telling us what surprised you most, because the most important conversations happen when real history finally gets the audience it deserves.